Welcome and thank you for joining us for the last session of the last day of the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Carlene Shamos. I am the Collective Impact and Equity Director at the Partnership for Strong Communities. And joining me for additional tech support is Emily Luke, our Research and Policy intern. This year, the CAHC is focused on thriving communities, and each session spotlights a unique approach to strengthening housing stability for households and communities across Connecticut. You can join the conversation at hashtag CAHC 2023 across social media. This session is titled Tenant Organizing and the Fight for Housing Justice. And before I turn it over to our presenters, we would like to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, our visionary sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing and Wells Fargo, our champion sponsors, Bank of America, J.D. Amelia & Associates, MMT Bank, Webster Bank, and the Melville Charitable Trust. And our foundation sponsors, Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, Crown Resnick, and Trinity Financials. These sponsors' deep support has allowed the conference to happen again this year. Last but not least, a big thank you to our featured investor, Sedeka House, for your support of the CAHC. A few housekeeping before we get started. The session is being recorded and will be made, and we'll ensure that all the recordings are available as soon as possible. Please remain unmute unless one of the speakers asks you to unmute yourself. And if you have any technology issues, please feel free to use the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send it to Carlene or to Emily, and we will do our best to assist you. Your speakers will let you know how they would like content questions to be submitted. And post the session, we have a session feedback survey, and you can find that by clicking the megaphone icon in the lobby. And we truly appreciate your feedback for these sessions. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Rashida to get us started.
Thank you so much, Carlene, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This is going to be an amazing discussion, and I'm just so happy to have you all with us. So just getting started, thank you for joining us for our panel, Tenant Organizing and the Fight for Housing Justice. I'm excited to engage in a conversation today regarding the ongoing developments in the realm of rental housing in Connecticut over the past few years, and the commendable efforts undertaken by various communities to address these issues. During the pandemic, and even prior to its onset, renters have unfortunately been subjected to numerous instances of institutional failures. These failures have resulted in a lack of protection against exploitative landlords, substandard living conditions, exorbitant rent increases, and an unjust eviction process that leaves tenants vulnerable to displacement. Today, I am honored to be in the presence of passionate advocates and dedicated organizers who have been tirelessly combating injustice and striving to enact legislation that safeguards the rights of tenants. Their unwavering efforts have focused on empowering tenants to form organizations, enabling them to negotiate with landlords, and enhance housing stability. By doing so, they are actively working towards ensuring that every individual can reside in a secure and sanitary home. We are joined by our panelists, Hannah Schreier, Jay Osborne, Sarah White, Teresa Quintana, and Kate Slininger, and we encourage you to engage in this conversation by placing any questions or comments that you may have in the chat box. We are also joined by housing advocate and my co-moderator, Maria Cuerda, and Dahlia Romanel as well. So I just really want to start off this discussion, this panel, with giving our panelists an opportunity to kind of introduce themselves and tell us a little bit more about what coerced them to be in this position right now. So we're going to start off with Hannah. Hannah, what got you involved with tenant organizing? Was there a specific experience that, made you feel the need to get involved?
Yeah, I would say that my first experience renting from a faceless corporate landlord in New York City was the first moment when I realized that as a renter, I actually don't have the type of power I need as an individual to even get my landlord to adhere to basic housing law. So I was in my early 20s, I was really broke and our heat wasn't working in our apartment. And we called and called and called. They kept coming. At first they didn't come, and then they started coming. And I remember that they said that it's hot, it's warmer inside the apartment than it is outside of the apartment. And this was, end of November. It was getting really cold. And so they were like, so you should be fine. Meanwhile, it was like, I would say 50 degrees inside the apartment. It also wasn't insulated very well. And so we spent and then what they did is they gave us space heaters, which is also one of the leading causes of apartment fires. So they said, you're fine, here's a space heater. And my roommates were like, well, that's that. And then we happened to run into our upstairs neighbor, Matthew, and we had a conversation with him where we said, hey, do you have heat? And he said, oh, no, we don't. We don't have heat either. And then we knocked on the downstairs neighbor's door and said, do you have heat? And he said, oh, no, I don't have heat either. And we'd been getting the same story all separately. And so when the three of us decided, we all said, okay, fine. When it's December 1st, we're going to withhold our rent. And we coordinated that. We didn't know what we were doing, but we were just like, I don't know, this seems like the thing that they care about. It was that moment when all of a sudden, I think it took 5 days, less than a week, the heat was fixed for everybody. And I think that was my first experience understanding that individually, I don't have any power, but collectively we do as renters. And then I had experiences over the years and then got involved in the tenant movement in New Haven. So that's maybe a little bit too long, but that was one of the defining experiences for me about why tenant unions are necessary.
Definitely not too long at all. And I think it's really worthwhile to share these experiences because who knows who's on this call today that may be experiencing something that's similar and feeling like, they're powerless. So it was really good to know that, you had other people that were not in the situation. The situation wasn't good, but, having people to come together with really makes you feel a lot less powerless. I'm going to kick the same question over to Jay. Jay, what got you involved with tenant organizing?
Well, about 3.5 years ago, I had moved to the building that I live in now. And as a new tenant, I found it surprising that 5 of my neighbors who were wheelchair bound at the time were struggling to get in and out of the building because we had a front door that was broken. And I thought, well, it'll be fixed in a day or two, maybe a part is on back order or something. That was in July. By October, the problem existed continually. And it got to the point where we were calling the fire department to let us in and out of the building because the door mechanism was so in disrepair. So when I would talk to the neighbors, I would let them in and out whenever I could, 5 a.m. as they're walking their service dogs and whatnot. And they would wait for somebody to come in or out so that they could gain access and egress to the building. I said, well, why aren't you guys, doing anything? Are you talking to the management? Oh, some had put in requests, but they were ignored. Very stereotypical stuff. We were afraid to speak up because those who had in the past leases weren't renewed and they're no longer in the building. So I thought, wow, okay, that's a problem. And by that first winter, I started organizing my neighbors, much like what Hannah was saying. There's strength in numbers, and I knew something had to change, and that I alone wasn't going to be the change.
Thank you so much for that, Jay. Yes, and if there is something that I want people to leave with today is that, you don't have to be alone in whatever you're dealing with. There are people that are willing to join together and come together and evoke change. How about you, Sarah? What got you involved in tenant organizing, and can you cite an experience for us that may have, coerced you to get involved?
So for me, the main reason I became a lawyer was really a terrible housing experience I had. Like Hannah and Jay, mine involved really severe mold. It was when I lived in Seattle, and one thing everyone knows about Seattle is it rains a lot after the beautiful summers. And as soon as the rain started in my apartment, which was a really tiny studio, there was about 10 inches of just solid black mold along the entire perimeter of my apartment, the really small space where I was sleeping and spending all my time and doing my work. And I started to get really sick. And I felt completely powerless. I had no idea what to do. I didn't know where to go. I was sick and missing class and missing work. And I think that experience of not knowing where to turn and feeling totally alone is one of the things that made me become a lawyer. But like a lot of lawyers, I think I went into it hoping that, the law could be more of a tool in giving tenants justice than I think it actually is in practice. And that has also, motivated me to turn to organizing, seeing the, terrible housing situations folks have had to deal with and how difficult it is to really make systemic change, to improve conditions for everybody in an apartment, especially when litigation takes years and years and years and often doesn't get people the results that they want and need and deserve, and the justice they should have. And so I've always really felt like organizing is really important in order for us to change, the laws and the systems we're dealing with, and also win changes at the building level. And so, as more folks in Connecticut started to turn towards tenant organizing during the pandemic, I was incredibly excited and, have been just like overjoyed to see the movement that's developing, what tenants are able to win in the immediate term as we, all build the power we'll need to shift these systems long term.
It has been a beautiful process to behold, seeing someone go from not knowing anything or not knowing what direction to go in and really feeling helpless to actually seeing people come together and write testimony and, attend different meetings and speak up for themselves. It's been a beautiful thing to see the organic growth of tenant organizing here in our state. I'm going to kick this question over to Teresa. Teresa, what got you involved with tenant organizing?
Thank you, Rashida. I am an immigrant myself, so I came to the U.S. Like 20-something years ago, and I have a horrible experience when I arrived here. When you are undocumented, you actually, and arrive to a new country, you don't know what the laws are, and the only things that you want is to survive, right? And so we get this apartment that it has absolutely everything what we are fighting right now. It has a lot of rats, cockroach, and horrible conditions. And we have to sleep in the floor because as an immigrant, you do not have furniture when you arrive here. And but we were happy because we have a roof. So we tried to make a safe and it was very expensive because the owners knew that we were like immigrants and undocumented. And it was hard, very hard. But anyway, we can use later on, I have to work in a program for our immigrants community. And that was during the pandemic because we have some kind of funds that we receive from some donors and to give it to our community. And interview and prove that our community were going through a horrible condition of housing. Of course they were because there wasn't any program in place for our undocumented community in Connecticut. And I have to interview them and I hear my story many, many times. And it was 20 years after. So that's why I'm here and I'm gonna do whatever what is in my hands for get justice for our community.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for sharing that. And lastly, we're gonna pass this question over to Kate.
Hi, thanks for having us today. I live up here in Putnam, Connecticut, the northeast corner of the state, and I live in a converted textile mill. It's one of the oldest mills in the country. And it was renovated about 4 years ago through grants, federal and state grants related to restoring brownfield sites to ease the housing crisis. So this place, the redevelopment project, was a combination of public and private money and grants, given to our landlord through green energy grants, affordable housing related grants, things like that. And all of us moved in the first wave of tenants. I moved in with an 18-month-old, and it turned out, well, we're in the middle of the lawsuit related to this, but right about a year ago, we found out that a 2-year-old was severely lead poisoned, even though, again, this was newly open to residents. And they had been lead poisoned with lead dust, which was at such an extreme degree that, like, I've never seen numbers in reports of lead with a situation like this. And so we've spent the whole year organizing. We established a union just a few weeks in. There's 82 units here. Since many tenants have left for other conditions that we've been facing, but we're holding strong here. And so we are fighting for lower rents while we address mold, water damage, all these things that poor construction practices because of a total lack of oversight and accountability and enforcement of regulations. It's basically a disaster of an affordable housing project. And I'm in a subsidized unit. Part of the project was they were supposed to include a certain number, but so the state subsidized our units, yet my toddler suffers from upper respiratory illnesses related to mold. This week he's been clutching an ice pack to his chest to fall asleep just so he can have like a break from the coughing. So that's the kind of conditions I'm organizing under. The union has enforced a rent. We created and enforced a rent freeze, just wildcat, and it wasn't enforced by Fair Housing Commission or anything. We just, as a union, did that. And so we're going to push even harder. Right now, we're organizing to do a $1 a month rent until all these issues are fixed and, brought under our control as tenants. So, we're fighting the privatization of housing and the total abuse of tenants by landlords in the state. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's these stories, it's these experiences that really drive home the importance of the work that we all are doing and why it's necessary. Our voices are necessary, not just in this space, but in our communities as well. So the next question that I want to ask is, can you highlight some of the functions of tenant unions for some of our individuals here that may be joining us that may not even really know what a tenant union is, right? What is it supposed to look like? What is it supposed to do? I'm actually going to start this question off with Sarah. So what are some of the functions of tenant unions? What do they look like?
I'm gonna pass it a little bit to my co-panelists who do more organizing work for part of that, but I would say from the legal perspective, tenant unions are allowed and even encouraged in Connecticut, and folks are protected from retaliation for up to 6 months for forming a tenant union. Something that's great about Connecticut law, though, is that it doesn't say what a tenant union is. And from an organizing perspective, a tenant union is really just tenants coming together to fight together for change. And that could be, a couple of folks who live in a multifamily. It could be a neighborhood where folks have different landlords. It could be one bigger building that's owned by a landlord, or across properties, across the city, or even a state owned by a landlord, or even something, at the city level where folks from different landlords are coming together to figure out how to support each other for change and how to shift things, at the local level and state level to benefit all tenants. So it can look a lot of different ways. And I think, sometimes folks can get hung up on, is it a tenant union or is it not? It can be a tenant union. And the question is what is going to be most effective and strategic in, winning these changes from your landlord and from the state or municipality as well. And I think like some of my co-panelists can do, a better job of answering that and talking about some of the different strategies that tenant unions in Connecticut are using and the different formations they're taking to win.
Absolutely. And we're going to kick that over to Jay.
So I like the question, what does a tenant union look like? It looks like all of our communities. It's a representation of everybody. We have every age group represented. We have every racial and ethnic group, every sexual identity group. We have retired folks. We have working folks. We have college students. It's the full gamut as far as our citizenry, right? So, yeah, that's just the look. If you want to go with the most basic.
I like that. Hannah, what do you think?
I think so. The way that I've been thinking about the definition of a tenant union, it's ripped a little bit from the definition of a labor union and other definitions of unions in general, which is that it's a group of people who are using their collective power, a group of tenants who are using their collective power to get the landlord to do what they want them to do and to get the landlord to stop doing what they don't want them to do. Sorry, maybe I said that in a confusing way, but the idea, right, is that it's about members using their collective power to get what they want and get what they deserve. So that can look like conditions remediation, that can look like better maintenance standards, that can look like lower rents, that can look like a predictable rent schedule. And so at Connecticut Tenants Union, the 3 campaigns that we're running, and within those campaigns, there's a lot of flexible types of variations of those campaigns. One is that we're running fights for collectively bargained leases. So the best way to actually hold a landlord accountable is through the legal contract of the lease. And at Blake Street, we have been negotiating and reached a tentative agreement with one of the landlords around lease terms and a predictable rent schedule for 2.5 years. That way people know what their rent raise is going to look like, and can prepare for that, and also can actually say, okay, this rent raise is acceptable to me or not, which was part of the negotiations. And so the idea is that right now the status quo is that your landlord can do whatever they want basically to tenants, and with a tenant union, that power is actually flipped on its head, and it says, actually, for you to continue being for you to continue being a landlord, you actually have to negotiate with tenants. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to run across the state is collectively bargained leases. Another thing that we're running is reestablishing fair rent commissions and getting them staffed. We see fair rent commissions more as a tool, not as an end goal, but they can be very helpful as we're pushing a fight and trying to get a landlord to negotiate. And then obviously, like within those campaigns, there's a lot of different ways to think about what it looks like to flex that collective power. So like what Katie was talking about, doing a $1 a month rent payment is a way of showing the landlord, right? You might not need one of us, but you need all of us. And together, when we actually flex that power, you realize that you have no choice but to actually come into contact with the tenants and agree to some terms. So I think that that's what a tenant union can look like. And there are a lot of definitions across the United States. And I think what's really exciting about CTTU is that we've recently restructured, and that we have 13 chapters from around the state now that are all doing different things, but overall shifting the balance of power between tenants and landlords.
I like the word collective, and I think that's something that we should just keep in mind also throughout this whole presentation, because as someone who has, talked to individuals who are tenants who have been going through, different diverse injustices to them, as it, relates to them renting, they often feel alone. And that is the biggest thing that I've noticed with individuals who don't know how to advocate for themselves. They feel powerless because they feel alone. And this idea and this thought and this movement of the collective is really something that I want to continue to harp on during this presentation, because I want anyone that watches this back, if they're here now, if they're going to watch it in the future, to recognize that, you are one person that may be going through something, but that doesn't mean that you are the only person that is going through something. And that, the collective, there's power in that collective. Katie, can you highlight some of the functions of tenant unions and kind of give your viewpoint on what they look like?
Sure. Yeah, so I think, it can kind of be a question of what do they look like, what are their function organizationally, which I think has been covered pretty well. But there's also a political or social function for people in the movement. One of them would be denaturalizing displacement through the forces of financialization and capital and the degradation of working class organizations throughout the country. We're left with a disorganized working class, bureaucratic, like entrenched bureaucracy that makes it impossible to access your rights on an individual level, and also has robbed you of your community through gentrification and other and more violent, methods of displacement. And so the tenant union is also a vehicle for reforming the working class as a collective, across social boundaries in terms of identity, but consolidated by our common class interest in fighting landlords and fighting private property relations that put us in these situations in the first place and take away our agency. So for me, we are building the collective power through these fights to challenge the overall system that makes housing a commodity, makes them empty commodities, turns land into, police occupied neighborhoods, and basically reversing that tide through exercises of collective power. So that's kind of a broader maybe picture, but I think really important.
I love that. And I love us linking back to these systems that are established and are essentially oppressing and failing us. These systems that were meant to work for us are actually working against us, unfortunately. Teresa, I want to wrap up with you. Can you highlight some of the functions? All of our panelists have been doing such an amazing job, but can you maybe find a highlight that wasn't mentioned before and, tell us from your viewpoint, what would a tenant union or tenant organizing look like?
Sure. Wants to say is that for me, the definition of tenant unions is after their whole frustration of the system. Because I have been working with this group of people who have been very frustrated with all the rights that the system says they have. And they actually have to fight for a long, long time. That is when they decide we can't do this anymore. We have to do something about it. And they are fighting and they are learning different ways to stand up for themselves. They actually are the power. Their stories are the ones who bring us here all together. They are the leader of this fight because we won't figure many things that is going on right now if it wasn't for them. We have to listen to the people. We have to be with them. We have to walk with them. And that way we're going to win everything what we decide to fight for. They are organizing. They are frustrated already. And we are ready to do it, right? And that's why we are here, because we want to share that information, because probably there's other people in the audience who are ready to fight too. No, I don't want to say to fight, but to actually change what is not working for our communities.
Thank you so much, Teresa. And, I know there may be people in here that are a little confused on where to start and confused on where to go. So I'm happy that we're all here to kind of encourage you all that, it starts with a collective and there's power in the collective. Moving on to the next question that I have. I know earlier each of us mentioned some proximity to experiences that have pushed us into the realm of tenant organizing, made us feel the need to organize. Are there any other challenges that maybe weren't mentioned earlier that come to mind that tenants may be facing that will be pushing them to organize. Essentially, why are tenants organizing? We've talked about the unjust conditions. We've talked about the rental increases. We've talked about lack of communication with some landlords. But are there any things that we may have left out of that discussion as to why tenants may be organizing? And I'm going to actually start this off with Katie.
Excuse me. Sorry, we, have upper respiratory problems here. Well, I mean, it probably depends on who you're asking and what region of the country. But for us, or for me, beyond the general disorganization of poor and working class people, through the pandemic, we saw an increasing amount of people falling out of the workforce, and people's you can fall from a professional class into the working class. You can fall from the working class into an unorganized class. So you're not, waged laborer. So I fall into that category. I was laid off at the beginning of the pandemic. And so were a lot of other, mothers of young children. And so we have, a challenge with, raising children and childcare, and just poverty in general can really weigh down organizing, which it's kind of ironic because you're the people who need to self-organize the most. For us, I would say tenants' own poverty and, material conditions is a main kind of hurdle. Geographic isolation, and even in a sense like political isolation, like our region isn't politically important to the state. So we kind of have to fight even harder to get any kind of media coverage or assistance from, organizations in other areas of the state. So we're kind of in the Wild West out here. Also, in terms of regulation, we're between departments of health up here. So it is both a major challenge for us, but, it can be we kind of take it as a challenge in the positive sense that, we have kind of an empty ground to build from scratch. But, anyway, that's my experience.
That's a very, very optimistic way to look at it. Like, okay, we may not have much, but that's good because that means that we could put much together, right? We could build much from this little bit or this not much that we have here. Jay, I saw you nodding along, so I really want to kick it to you because I feel like you're really excited to answer this question. I'm really excited to hear your answer.
Oh, well, I was agreeing with what Kate was mentioning. I don't think there's any new bad thing that is happening in housing with landlords. I think the issue is pretty basic. When you look at when I worked as a provider of housing, I would always say to the managers who worked under me, we're a service industry. We're just like the resorts or the hotels. The difference is our guests stay longer, right? So the problem is we're providing a service, right? Or our landlords are providing a service, and then that service becomes diminished. And that diminishment can be across the board, whether it's the mold, the doors not being fixed, the leaky, whatever, all of those services that are no longer being maintained is what is motivating people like never before for a host of reasons. And to be honest, I think people really have never been in their homes as much as before, and rents have never been this high. So when you look at all of these factors, one, people are in a space looking around at what's not right more than they ever had in their history. On top of that, the rents, the increases in the rent are going up higher than their parents, their aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters can ever, share with them and story like, oh my God, when I was young, it wasn't like that. All of these things collectively are getting people to think something is really broken. And I don't know how to fix it, but I know that there needs to be a fix. Well, we start talking with each other, and that's how tenant unions are forming. It's really just in the laundry room, on the way to throwing out your trash, in and out of your car, talking with the neighbor. And that's how this is happening statewide.
Jay, that was such a good point because honestly, quarantine was one thing that made people realize a lot of things that was wrong with their apartments. I was one of those people who was walking around my apartment. I'm like, it's unusually cold in here. this is not fixed. I think I asked about this being fixed maybe months ago, right? So just having that time to kind of sit back and recognize like things are not right. Sarah, I saw that you put your hand up.
Yeah, just to build off of what everybody said, I think another thing a lot of folks realized during the pandemic is that another world really is possible. There was a time where, student loans were paused, folks were getting stimulus checks, we were getting child credits every month. There was an abundance of money at, the local and state level through ARPA for all sorts of programs. And there was this moment where I think folks saw that our system can be different. And it was obviously, we were in the conditions of a pandemic. It was very difficult, a hard time. But I know I felt like we could win change. We could shift these systems to work differently and make them work even better, than they were maybe during that brief period. And I think there is this sort of cascading effect that we're seeing both within Connecticut and across the country as more folks organize in their buildings and communities and win things, and we see what's possible, and that encourages others to, talk to their neighbors, start trying things. So I think that's kind of, what's spurring things as well as the material conditions that everyone mentioned that make it just so hard to rent and get by right now.
Absolutely agree with you. Hannah, do you have anything that you want to jump in with?
Yeah, I think the core problem is we live in a country and a society where housing is a commodity, right? That is someone can make profit out of a basic need of human beings. And the logic of that has extended to a point where we have landlords who are, for example, one of our targets, he just bought his 10th vacation home. And there are children in all of his many of his properties that are lead poisoned. The conditions are terrible, and yet he has 10 vacation homes that I'm sure he never goes to. He doesn't even live in the United States. And so when you have a system of housing that is based on the idea that one person or a couple of people can make a lot of money out of a basic human need and a basic human right, you end up in a situation where it's very difficult for people to make rent right now. Rent is just gone up to a point that is unbelievable. It's typically 50% or more of people's paychecks. And there's not really a counter to that. And the counter is the people, right? The counter is us, the renters of the world, who are actually saying, no longer is this system where the commodification of my basic right allowed, where you can have 10 vacation homes and I don't have heat all winter. And so I think that that's part of the core of what the tenant union movement is trying to do, which is saying this way that we've been thinking about housing as a country has created a system where children are getting sick, where people we're putting their whole paychecks towards housing that is making them sick, that is falling down on them, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think that's the core of what the tenant union movement, I think, is trying to change.
Absolutely.
Why people are organizing.
Right? Not profit over people, but people over that profit, right? We should be caring about the people more than we're caring about making money. And that it's something that has not been happening, that people are waking up to and recognizing is not right. So when we talk about tenants and organizing, it's hard to start, right? Where do you put that first step? Where does that first step go? How do we organize, right? How do you encourage people to start organizing, right? Do we start legislatively? Is it more of like a social thing? Are we, is it more educational? What is the way that you encourage tenants to start organizing? And I am actually going to kick that back to you, Hannah, to start off with.
It's a good question and good timing. So this weekend we had a 2-day training for tenant power where we were learning the tools and the skills of how to have the organizing conversation with people who are interested in forming tenant unions or people who are just renters living in difficult conditions facing rent raises. And so typically the first step is knocking on doors, talking to your neighbors, and getting a group of leaders together to say, okay, I'm committed to this project. We're going to divide the complex up and hold X number of units through this process and decide collectively what is it that we want as a tenant union. But the first step is always knocking on your neighbor's door, finding other leaders, and getting those leaders together and saying, we're committed to doing this together, and this is what this could look like. And then from those leaders, getting a certain level of membership signed up, getting a certain level of membership engaged, and growing the leadership committee. And again, like, you know, for us, some of the horizons we're looking at is trying to fight for a collectively bargained lease. It can look different for other tenant unions based on what their needs are. But in that process, you're also asking people, what would you want to see in a lease? What would you want to see your landlord do, or what would you want your landlord to stop doing? But again, I think it's really about the core thing is knocking on your neighbor's door and making a commitment with other folks who are ready to do this with you.
Thank you for that, Hannah. Katie, how do you encourage tenants to start organizing?
Well, I'm largely self-organized. You know, I've had some really good mentors and support from some organizations in the state, but I have to motivate myself to organize and you know, motivate my neighbors here. You know, we had a pretty good social fabric here prior to organizing the union. So we kind of had to just call on those relationships. It was such an extreme case and such an emergency that that initial buy-in wasn't super difficult. It took a lot of work, but in terms of actually, you know, convincing people. Now we're in the process of, you know, growing out into our town beyond just our apartment complex. And so that's where, you know, I'm going to start having to really apply some of these, you know, organizational lessons. But yeah, we're going to start by just knocking on multifamily homes. You know, we're the biggest apartment complex here. And so a lot of the renters are in, you know, these smaller homes, but you know, calling on the other moms of Noah's schoolmates, you know, to start, because I know where they're at and things like that, and just kind of plugging away at it with my tenant members here. But, you know, the thing that comes to mind too, beyond just, you know, reaching people based on their immediate material needs, the long-term fight requires, you know, a political development and a class consciousness that comes through working together, speaking together, struggling through certain strategic questions together. And because things can get fixed, a landlord can respond to you and fix it. So where are we going from there? You know, you can get a certain lease that you like, but is that really, you know, is that where we're stopping, or are we saying people should control where they live and not, you know, at all be accountable, or not at all answer to someone else for how they live, or whether their ability to live at all. And so kind of building those broader horizons to kind of perpetuate the struggle, or to a point where we're actually freeing people from this relationship with the landlord. That to me has been a source of like renewing energy. When we do solve one problem, we are still plugged into that longer term fight and the movement with other tenant unions, you know. So that solidarity with labor and with other tenant unions and other forms of grassroots organizing kind of will keep the, you know, the machine running over time.
Keep the momentum going. Awesome. Jay, what are your thoughts?
Well, one of the things that helped me actually once our little group started, and we got linked up with the Connecticut Tenant Union, which was really where it all really came together, was the trainings that they provided for us, sitting with others from around the state and doing role plays of how to talk not only to neighbors, but even to landlords potentially. Those types of practice sessions are very practical. You know, teaching your neighbors how to write letters, or to be able to write their testimony before the local town council or state reps or whatever. All of that is very, very practical, and it's really necessary. Again, when I started, I didn't know that was all needed until it was. And then I realized, wow, this is a thing that is needed. And then there was the Connecticut Tenant Union providing the fix. And so I'm really grateful for that. And I certainly am trying to carry that on and pass down that training, to the next.
Yes, I love the coming together and the writing letters and learning about the steps in the process that are necessary to evoke change. Sarah, how do you encourage tenants to start organizing?
I mean, I think the number one thing is just to start talking to your neighbors. And I think sometimes people can get caught up in like, what form does it need to take? Do we need bylaws? Do we need leaders? But really, like leadership, elections, things like that, really it all starts with having conversations and thinking about who is it that I know in the building, even if it's just like someone you say hi to on the elevator, or well, if the elevator is broken, the stairs, which is the case in a lot of the buildings we organize in, or just like, who do you recognize? And it can be a little difficult to have a conversation with a stranger, but I've been talking to hundreds of tenants in Hartford and other places over the past couple of years, and if there's one thing that's a conversation starter, it's complaining about a bad landlord, because chances are if you're having problems, everyone else is, and there will be a lot to talk about. And just starting that connection, and then figuring out, often like organizing starts very small with just a few people, and then kind of building out from there, and having some, maybe targets about how many people you want to bring in, but building that core group, of leaders in a building that are going to help bring others in, develop a strategy, share demands about what people want, a strategy for how to get there, and, execute on it.
Yes, you don't have to hold it in by yourself. Let it out. Speak to someone. Reach out to someone that is close to you, because, as Sarah said, if you are having an issue, it's very likely someone else is having similar issue. Teresa, how do you encourage tenants to start organizing?
I usually tell my community that they don't let other people tell the stories, that they are the leaders of this fight. I usually offer everything what they need. We need language justice to unite all of us, because we have the same story and the same cause, and they know that. Because as somebody says, at the beginning, everybody feels alone, but we are not alone. Many of us share the same stories, and we have to know and start listening to each other. The language barrier is on purpose, because they don't want us to be united. So I offer everything, absolutely everything, what I can, to all those wonderful leaders to be here by others, and to bring more unity and bring power. So that is what I'm doing.
Absolutely. I love these answers. And, we've talked about today some of the struggles, some of the challenges, but really one of the things that I want to leave us off with, as I'm looking at the time and trying to be conscious of that, is the victories, right? The achievements. So, what have you won or achieved with tenant organizing? And I'm going to start this question off with Jay.
Well, the very first meeting, I have to back up a little bit. So just so this makes sense, when Sarah was talking about the connections, I was walking my dog in a public park right next to the building I live in, which is also another mill that's been converted into apartments. My landlord bought that building. At that point, it was a recent purchase. So I ran into a tenant from that building who I don't know on the bridge right next to us, which is a little park. And she was like, "Oh, you live next door?" I said, "Yeah, I live there." She goes, "Your owner bought our building." I said, "Yeah, how's it going?" Well, there you go. There's the story. Not going well. So that was our first alliance, if you will. The conversation started. I said, I'm trying to organize the people in my building. She said, I need to do the same thing. I said, hey, what if we join forces? So thus the Wyndham Mills, you can see the logo behind me. The Wyndham Mills Tenant Union was formed, with the two buildings now organizing together, all because of a conversation in the park in the neighborhood about the common landlord, the common problem. With that said, our very first meeting, just a couple months later, we met with our buildings department, code enforcement officers, and we had documented at that point far too much, books worth of neighbor testimonies, et cetera, et cetera. And we brought it to the manager of the department, the director, and we said, hey, this is a problem. You know, this is going on now years. Some of these tenants, they don't know what to do. Some are afraid to speak, much like Teresa mentioned. Our Latino neighbors are oftentimes more intimidated, more reluctant. And we said this is a problem. So they scheduled for the first time in Willimantic's history a 2 building wide apartment by apartment inspection, mandatory. They've never done that. They usually do the outside, the peripheral, you know, the generic, let's look at the storage rooms and the you know, the laundry rooms and that kind of thing. They went apartment by apartment in 2 buildings, 132 apartments, and they had never done that. What came out of that inspection is an encyclopedia of violations and problems, still unresolved. So the fight is real, but at least it's on record now that this is what it turned up. So that was huge. Now the town, though not mandated to have a fair rent commission, our local town council is actually pushing for it because of the need to secure housing in our town. So that was probably our biggest accomplishment thus far. And we started in January of this year.
Wow. Wow. Progress in such a short amount of time. Sarah, can you jump in on this question? What have you won or achieved with tenant organizing?
I'm going to go off question a little bit, Rashida. Sorry. And I think it would be great if Teresa could talk about like some of the amazing organizing she's been supporting in Hartford that has won a lot here. But I want to talk some about what we haven't won yet and what we're hoping to win next year. For the past couple of years, like tenants in Connecticut have been involved in legislative campaigns, which won a right to counsel for tenants. And last year, we're involved in pushing for expanded fair rent commissions. And then last year, we're involved in the Cap the Rent campaign, which was seeking a 3% cap on rent increases and universal just cause eviction protection, which did not win, but did really energize the tenant movement. And this year, we're going back to the legislature to push for universal just cause eviction protection so everyone can have the security of at least knowing that their landlord's not going to evict them for no reason, which for a lot of tenants in Connecticut is not the case right now. And as we saw, you know, in New Haven with folks with the Blake Street tenant unions, landlords use folks having a month-to-month lease to push people out when they're fighting back, when they're organizing, when they're even just asking for things to be repaired as a cover for discrimination for all sorts of reasons. So we haven't won that yet, but you know, with our combined power of the different tenant unions that have formed, you know, other tenants are hoping to win that next year.
Thank you, Sarah. And Teresa, what have you won or achieved with tenant organizing?
Oh, that is, we have been like, I love that you says that we have to remember the word collaborative, because we have been working in community, collaborating to each other's, and for our only purpose, our love for our community, right? Because we don't want to see them outside of their places, living in camp, in a tent, or things like that. So we have been collaborating with many of the people who's here in this that I really love and I appreciate, because we have been having popular educations with our community. We were learning each other, helping each other to achieve. And one of them was our Weathersfield tenant unions. That is how they call themselves, because they actually were like learning together that what's to pay attention to what was going on their neighbors. And they realize that they have a new landlords that is happening all the times, right? In Hartford or in any other place in Connecticut, by the way, around the US. They are changing, and none of these people have any kind of lease, or they were actually Spanish speakers. And when we try to help them at the beginning, they don't have any kind of forms in Spanish. So we, in collaboration with many of our friends here, we get all these forms, we help them to fill it up, and they get empowered, and they claim to the city that they need to be fixed, their apartments need to be fixed before they raise their rent, and that doesn't happen. So they did their rent strike. So they start paying our rent on court. And that was a big win, because they have been paying the rent for like 8 months, and they actually won in court, because they get 50% of what they pay on on court, and they actually get power to and says, okay, nobody, if we have to do this, if we have to fight for our rights, it have to be us, right? And we were there in community, and they are doing it. So that is, I think that's the big win, because they are still fighting, not only for them, but for the rest of our community.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I'm gonna kick it quickly to Katie and then over to Hannah. In the interest of time to wrap up, just what have you won or achieved with tenant organizing?
I'll be quick anyway, because someone's up from their nap. But we, since let me think, since February, we've we demanded through a demand letter, and then we filed housing court cases. That was a form of a rent strike. So we held rent money in an escrow account through the housing court. Through that pressure campaign, we got a rent freeze, which we've since enforced through people's lease renewals since. So anyway, so a number of tenants partaking in the rent strike, including us, wanted a several months rent back. Not all of them went the way we wanted to, but it helped us understand kind of the process a little bit more. So frankly, that education was worth a lot also. So that's like our main material one. We've won about $72,000 were released from the Department of Housing through our demands to finish lead inspections that the landlord was refusing to do. So that was kind of a material benefit. Basically, I have maybe less quantitative kind of wins that I could go on about in terms of working through displacement with certain tenants that maybe would have been kicked out without joining the tenant union. These little victories to me mean a lot. But obviously we're working on the bigger scale wins as well.
Thank you, Katie. And Hannah?
Yeah, so we've passed municipal ordinances in New Haven and Hamden recognizing tenant unions, which is a really helpful tool in our retaliation case. This tentative agreement that we have with Ocean Management is also really exciting, as it actually creates a standard for maintenance, communication, et cetera, all of the issues that they've been having. And Ocean Management tried to give the members of Blake Street Tenant Union a $280 rent raise effective in a week and a half in June. And thus far, they have not been able to actually raise the rent at all, other than through the negotiated contract of 2.5 years. So we've actually got a freeze for the last several months as they've been fighting. We've also, I know Sarah was part of a group of folks who won a lot of money from the city of Hartford for things like lawyers, for housing conditions and et cetera. I think we've also won lots of smaller things like that are very, very important, like maintenance fixes. We've gotten inspectors assigned to buildings, et cetera. And I'll stop there because I know we're over time, but I think that there are big and small things that are very tangible that have been really excited that we've been able to win.
Thank you so much. And honestly, this was such an amazing panel. I just want to thank each and every one of you for not only participating today, but for the amazing work that you have been doing. And I'm hoping that anyone that is out here listening to us today, who has joined us, feels empowered, right? Learns about the power of the collective. And, it can start as simply as you reaching out to your neighbor and having a conversation. And, one of the questions that I had that I'm going to just tie into this conclusion of mine was, sometimes we could be a little bit speculative and people ask the question like, in a perfect world, what would this look like, right? In a perfect world, what does the world look like through the lens of tenant organizing victory? And I would say that it looks like a world of love, where people are provided for, where people are safe, where people are healthy, and people have that basic human right that is housing. So I just want to thank each and every one of you for participating and joining us today. I'm sorry that we didn't get as much time for questions as we wanted to, but I am actually going to throw up a contact slide that if you would like to connect with the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, or you would like to connect with the Connecticut Tenants Union, you can contact either one of us here by email or by phone. I want to thank the Partnership for Strong Communities for putting together this amazing 2 days of, different topics and different workshops. And I just want to thank, again, each and every one of my panelists for joining us today. Please feel free to screenshot this, although this recording will be available at some other time. And I'm going to kick back to Carlene to see if there's any closing remarks that she may have to make.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us to the tail end of the conference. And for those of you who will be joining us for the reception, I look forward to seeing you all later this afternoon. Thanks, and have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye.